Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. So today we are going to continue our journey to Endgame with part 6, and we will be looking at the 2011 film Thor. Now, this film, I do have some issues with it. I don't find it particularly good. I think it's the weakest of the original Avengers origin films. I think that the other three do better jobs at introducing their characters. And I'll go over that. But we got to start off kind of from the first scene of this movie. Well, actually, even before we get into that, the casting. I enjoy the casting. The casting is actually fairly good. Chris Hemsworth as Thor, he was untested at the time. If I remember correctly, he got the role because of his role as George Kirk as in the Star Trek reboot series, which he only had like 5 minutes of screen time. But that ultimately landed him that role. From what I remember at the time, and then you have Natalie Portman, who's coming in as Jane Foster, and again, this is her after her Star Wars days. This is 6 years later after Revenge of the Sith, so she had been removed, and I think this was before she had done like Black Swan and stuff like that. Um, Kat Dennings also has a minor role in this movie, as does Skarsgård. Stellan Skarsgård would also return in Avengers and Thor: The Dark World, um, as would Kat Dennings and Natalie Portman. So, we kind of established the lower echelon of the characters, or the side characters, essentially, obviously this film was teased at the end of Iron Man 2, where we get to see the in the post credit scene we get to see Thor's hammer in the crater, which is in New Mexico. Now, I believe it's New Mexico. And so what happens is this is kind of why the film is a bit clunky with the first scene, and I feel like this film is way too it's way too rushed almost with the time frame that it takes place in. The beginning of the film, uh, like I said before, it doesn't really do a good job, um, essentially, of establishing the Thor character. Um, and I don't mean that in the sense that it does a good job at a point, but really the entire opening scenes in Asgard are what establish Thor. Now, the opening scene we get is Thor coming down to Earth from the Bifrost, and Jane Foster accidentally hitting him with her car. Now, it does one of those things. It's kind of like Iron Man. It does one of those things where it shows that scene, and then it back cuts to a day or two before that, when he's in Asgard and the events leading up to him coming to Earth and losing his Thor powers. Um, it works in Iron Man because that little scene at the beginning tells you a lot about Tony Stark, and it sets a lot of things up. And then you go back, and all of those things are kind of reinforced in those first 15 to 20 minutes of the film. With Thor, it's not that simple. I think if you had cut that part out entirely, I think you would have been fine. I think you should have just started with Thor and Asgard. Introduce us to Asgard, introduce us to the Warriors 3 and Sif, and all the supporting cast, Loki, Odin, Freya, like all of the people that are involved in Asgard. Um, and by the way, Anthony Hopkins plays Odin, who that's a brilliant casting, and the fact that they got him is great, and the fact that he also came back for Thor: The Dark World and Thor: Ragnarok. Um, but you go into this and you kind of look, and you see that that opening scene's a little bit clunky. Then when we get into the Asgard stuff, then it gets kind of interesting. I like the setup for this. They set up Asgard, they show all this stuff. You kind of get into the Norse mythology type. They explain a bit of it. If you know Norse mythology, you'll get some of this, or if you know the comics, the Marvel version of Asgard, you'll get it. But these scenes, essentially, they establish Thor as he's a hothead. He's the guy that's supposed to be. He's the favorite to become king, and it's very early on that they set up that Loki is essentially the jealous brother. He's not a. He plays very innocent, but in reality, if you know the comic books or you know Norse mythology, you know Loki's an asshole. But they set him up to be kind of the innocent brother. He's weaker. He's not as brave or as strong or as able to do the things that Thor does. He's essentially in his brother's shadow. And this leads into a very strange conundrum with Odin, where you don't really understand why he makes the choices that he makes, and he's brought up as almost this omnipotent god in the film, where they say that you know Odin he does everything for a reason. Um, and some of those reasons aren't really very clear. Like why he took Loki as a baby, because Loki's not his biological child, and we find that out later in the film. But he's still his child. But the thing is, he was never going to become king, and they never really reinforced that when he was young. They never said, "Oh, well, you can't be king for such and such a reason." uh, and it was very strange the way that they kind of set it up, because Odin almost sets up that Thor and Loki are going to have conflict when they get older, and it's very very bizarre. The other thing that this movie does very well is it does set up a bit of it sets up a little bit of the cosmic realm of Marvel, because it does deal. Asgard is its own realm. It's in space. Essentially, Thor and them, they're all aliens. Essentially, the Asgardians. Um, but to go back, uh, those opening scenes set up Thor as brave and all this, but then you also see that he's arrogant and he's gullible, because Loki is able to trick him, and he's able to trick him basically into disobeying Odin and acquiring Odin's wrath. And there's this whole thing where basically um, Thor believes that the frost giants broke into Asgard to try and steal an Asgardian artifact, and they were killed by the Destroyer, which is a giant suit of Asgardian armor that fires fiery laser beams out of its face. Um, and in this, um, you kind of, you understand what's happened at that point. By the time he's banished, you know that he made a colossal screw up. Um, at the same time, you're questioning Loki, but his entire plot hasn't essentially come forward yet. Although you can tell where it's going. Again, this movie is very kind of paint by numbers in terms of its plot, and I take some points away for that. Because if you do something generic, that's fine. But if you do something generic and then you don't add any kind of a flair to it, it just stays generic. You can look at it, the superhero film structure, and you can say, okay, yeah, it's the same thing over and over again. But the difference is the characters and the interactions and the supporting cast and the powers and all that stuff, all the nuancy stuff. Thor really doesn't. The film itself doesn't really it doesn't do anything amazing, and that's kind of why I give it, that's kind of why the plot's just a little kind of just too plain for me. Um, Although it does, so after those opening scenes, we kind of discover that Thor's shortcomings essentially. He's arrogant. He's very hot-headed. He's strong, but sometimes that strength is misused because he's easily tricked or stupid. Um, and that causes Odin to essentially banish him to Earth, and Odin throws Thor's hammer to Earth, but makes it so that Thor has to prove his worth in order to use the hammer again. And this is when we have Thor meet Natalie Portman and the supporting cast. So this is kind of when this movie hits a bit of a snag for me. Now, I like the idea of putting Thor in this situation because it does humble him, and that's the idea. But I feel like this moves a bit too fast. So we get the awkward comedy because Thor's he's used to being in Asgard. He doesn't really know how to function in day to day life on Earth. He doesn't understand how things work, and they essentially have to teach him. He's almost like a child. Kat Dennings and. Uh, Stellan Skarsgård and Natalie Portman all have to kind of teach Thor how to be a normal person in society. At the same time, they're also trying to find out what happened. Now, people have discovered Thor's hammer out in the desert. And they've been trying to move it and stuff like that. And there's actually a really funny Stan Lee cameo where they're trying to pull it out with a truck, and they have a chain hooked up to the axle, and the truck goes forward, and the axle gets pulled out. But it shows that Stan Lee's driving the truck. But I think that's one of his better cameos. But then, of course, Shield shows up, and this is another main role for Clark Gregg as Phil Coulson again. He comes into the movie, and he does a good job. He's a bit more no nonsense serious in this as opposed to kind of wisecracky or anything like that. He's kind of like, I don't know how to explain it. In some of the other Marvel films that he was in, he was more softly stern, I guess is the best way I can put it, where he would say things in almost like a pleasant tone, like a "hi, how are you, neighbor" kind of way. But the things that he would say and the things that he would do would be very, very, like, "You're going to do what the hell I want you to do right now." But in this movie, it seems like he's almost kind of like it seems like he's annoyed through parts of the movie. Especially there's a scene at the end where he gets really pissed because he thinks that the destroyer suit is actually a Stark product, and he gets pissed because nobody told him that Stark was sending like a suit or something or a robot to go do something. But back to the plot line. But so now Shield has found Thor's hammer. Now we have the whole plot line where Thor is trying to get his hammer back, and this leads into a really really good scene, where they break into this research base. There's also a neat little cameo by Hawkeye, who's played by Jeremy Renner, who would come in again in Avengers, and he really, Chris Hemsworth essentially makes his way through the whole facility and beats the crap out of a bunch of guys. Even though he doesn't have his super strength, he's still physically he's a strong person. Even though he's had his superior Asgardian traits stripped from him by Odin, he's still able to essentially, maybe not mop the floor, but he's essentially able to beat the living crap out of everybody that comes across his path. And he makes his way to the hammer, and it's a great scene where it's pouring rain, and Chris Hemsworth grabs the hammer, and he's trying his hardest to move it, and he can't move it, and he's pulling on it with all his might. You can see all of his muscles in his arms and everything are flexing and tensing, and everything about that one scene in that movie is great because it shows the epitome of the Thor character in that film, which is that he is trying so hard to just be the best and do he believes that he's entitled to certain things, and this is his moment where he realizes that those things can be taken away, and they have been taken away, and he doesn't know how to get them back necessarily. Um, and it's a growing moment for his character, where he finally realizes that. And of course, after all said and done, he gets captured by Shield, and they hold him. But that scene in particular is really really good. Now I'm gonna skip ahead to the scene. Loki comes to visit Thor on Earth in a hologram. It's a visual like hologram type of form or whatever. But essentially, he explain. This is really where we see Loki's true colors. Is he tells them that their father is dead, and that they are no, not that he's dead. That he doesn't want Thor to come back, and he can't come back, and a bunch of this other stuff about I actually don't know. Sorry, he does say that Odin is dead, but he says that you can't come back, and Mother doesn't want you back, and all this stuff. And he basically just tells him straight lies, and it's kind of a gut wrenching scene when you think about it, because essentially Thor he's been stripped of his hammer, of his power, and now he's being told that the people that he cares about, his friends and his loved ones, don't want him back because they believe that because he's been led to believe that his failure has led to his father's death. And it's really just a scene where, like, you can't get much lower than that. Like, Thor is literally at the bottom of the barrel at that point, and you can see it when Clark Gregg walks back in the room, where he's just kind of staring, and he's not really even saying anything. He's just kind of staring, and nothing's really happening. But here's kind of the again, this is the turning point for Thor, where he has literally hit rock bottom, and he goes back, and Jane Foster's Natalie Portman's character, Jane Foster, she manages to break him out essentially by saying that, oh, he's a scientist, he's a little, he's off, he went temporarily insane because they stole all their research and stuff. Shield confiscated all of Jane Foster's research, and uh, basically gets brought back, and he starts to bond with these other people. He starts to bond with Kat Dennings and Stellan Skarsgård, and more specifically, Natalie Portman's character Jane Foster, and the two wind up having a romance. But a scene that happens a bit later on that really shows what exactly it kind of explains Asgard in a way that makes sense. And Thor has it's a nuanced and very short way of explaining it, but it works. And it's the idea of they're sitting and they're watching the stars, and Thor's trying to map out all the realms, and tell Natalie Portman about the nine realms and the tree of life and all of that, and all the stuff from Norse mythology. And he's explaining that you call it science, or no, you call it magic, or you call it science, we call it magic. In my world, it's one and the same. Or you think of science and magic, in my world, it's one and the same. So it's really the idea that the Asgardians are just so technologically advanced that what they have seems like magic to normal people. Uh, and it's a really good way of kind of explaining Asgardians, their world in general. Um, but it's a good back and forth. He has a few really good scenes in there. There's a drinking scene with him and Skarsgård, and it again, it kind of shows like Thor is kind of coming back into into the fold. Essentially, he's kind of accepted his lot in life, and he understands that why he's there, and he's trying to make the best of it, and I get that. But the problem I think at this point is that the movie is moving way too fast. He's literally been on Earth, I think at this point, he's been on Earth for 2, maybe 3 days, and all of this has transpired. This should have taken place over a course of months, not days, months. One thing I'll say about Captain America: The First Avenger is that movie, the scope of it is roughly, I think it's a little over a year. Um, or more than a year, from the very beginning of the film to the end of the film, because I think the beginning of the film is 1942 or 43 and the end of the film is 44. So you have a scope there, and you have a way to develop the relationship between Captain America and Peggy Carter. In this, it feels like Jane Foster and Thor have developed this deep romantic relationship over a course of a couple of days, which doesn't flow right. It doesn't flow right from a plot narrative. And again, I think you should have stretched out the time frame. I think you should have made it more evident that a lot more time has passed with Thor on Earth. Because the other thing is, they say, "Oh, your father died," and then the next day he's serving eggs and smiling and laughing with people. It's like, that's a bit odd. That is a bit odd. But back in Asgard, people are getting Loki's essentially kind of taken over. Odin has gone into his, they call it the Odin sleep. It's again, that's something that's never really 100% explained. It's just basically like they explain it. Essentially, it's a deep sleep that he goes into when he gets like worn out or something like that, and they're not sure when he'll wake up. And Loki essentially takes over the kingdom because Thor has been banished and Odin is in the Odin sleep, so he's the next person to take the throne. And his whole thing is he wants to destroy the frost giants. And this is after he's found out that as a child, Odin took him during the war that he has with Yafi the frost giant. They found a frost giant child, which was Loki. And Odin took him in and raised him as his own son. Now, again, this kind of feeds into that weird thing of like, oh, Odin does everything for a reason. Well, what reason would he have to pit both of his sons against each other? And it just kind of factors into that of like, when if Loki ever found out about that, what the hell would happen? Um, and it's very, very odd. This is also, I believe, if I remember correctly, the first time that we see Loki in his comic book style horned helmet, the golden horned helmet that he wears in the comics. Um, backtrack, and the Warriors 3 and Sif are wary of Loki. They know they don't know what's happened to Thor. Well, they know that he's been banished, but they're concerned because they think Loki's doing something, and they think there's weird stuff in the water here. So they decide to go to Earth. They use Heimdall, who's played by Idris Elba, who's essentially the gatekeeper for the Bifrost, and they want him to open up a Bifrost to Earth. They want to go visit Thor. So they go visit him, and then we have the conflict that comes into play where Thor then realizes that his brother has basically usurped the throne and deposed his father and and orchestrated him to be banished. So we have a whole situation now where Thor has essentially realized the truth, and his friends are there. So Loki, knowing this, dispatches the destroyer robot to Earth in order to finally kill Thor, or to kill him and to also kill the Warriors 3, who are the only people that are left that can stop him from accumulating absolute power. And this is essentially, we essentially, now it's when we see his entire goal, which his entire goal is to essentially rule the nine realms with an iron fist. And his first step is to destroy the frost giants, which are their main adversary. And at the same time, to trick his brother into thinking that he has been banished, uh, and to basically emotionally break him and make sure he doesn't come back, and then to put his father into a comatose state so that he cannot rule. But this is where we see Loki's true colors, and this would carry forward into Avengers and into all the other films that Loki shows up in Thor, Thor: The Dark World, and Thor Ragnarok. Less than Thor Ragnarok, though. He's changed quite a bit at that point. But Tom Hiddleston does actually a very good job of playing that character in multiple films, and I enjoy his performances. But going forward, you have the what essentially is the climax of the film, where you have the fight between. It starts with the Warriors 3 and Sif versus the Destroyer. They get their asses handed to them, which rightfully so. That makes sense. Then Thor has this, this is the growing moment. This is the growing moment in this movie, which I like Thor's character arc in this movie. Don't get me wrong. I really do enjoy Thor's character arc. The problem is, again, I feel it should be more spread out because it feels like it's compacted into a course of about 3 to 4 days. And it's very strange, especially for beings that supposedly live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Um, but Thor has this moment where he talks to Loki through the Destroyer, and he's basically saying that he forgives him, and all he wants him to do is stop this, and don't hurt anybody, don't hurt any innocent people. And this really shows where Thor is. Thor knows he can't fight back right now because he's just a normal human. He's more muscular than a normal human, but he, for all intents and purposes, he's essentially an ant, and he can be squashed very easily. So the only thing he has left is his words. Even though in the movie it does maintain that he's somewhat genuine when he says this, he's having this is his only option, and he knows it, as opposed to just going up and trying to punch the thing with his hand and probably breaking his hand. Um, but of course, Loki doesn't take that into account and hits him with the gauntlet of the destroyer, and they believe that Thor has been killed by this. And because, he's a regular person and he just got, backhanded by a giant suit of Asgardian armor. Um, and this is when, again, because it's the turning point in the film, you have to have it happen where Thor regains he proves that he is worthy to wield the hammer, and the hammer comes back to him. And the whole moment where his armor forms back over his body, and he defeats the destroyer, and then Heimdall brings Thor back to Asgard to depose Loki. Now, what Loki has done is, after Thor comes back, he has basically locked the Bifrost permanently on, so that it projects energy. So it's essentially it's almost like an energy gun, which is weird. This is kind of a strange plot point where this is like his idea. So the world where the frost giants live is called Jotunheim, and he points this. Essentially, it's just a space laser at Jotunheim and leaves it on. And by doing that, apparently he's destroying the planet, or the planet that they live on, what do they call it, a realm of Jotunheim, where all the frost giants are, and killing them. And the whole idea is that if he leaves it on long enough, it'll just destroy their entire world and kill all of them. Um, and earlier on in the movie, Anthony Hopkins has a really good line about knowing when to wage war and when to not, and stuff like that. And that's why he told Thor he shouldn't go pick a fight with the frost giants, because it'll just cause war and pain and everything else. It's easier just to leave them be, and less violent and less bloody. But he comes back, and he now that this thing is destroying Jotunheim, so he has a fight with Loki on the Bifrost Bridge, which then uh, he has a fight with Loki on the Bifrost Bridge, which winds up, he winds up defeating Loki, and it is actually a really funny scene where he just puts his hammer down on Loki's chest and just leaves it there so Loki can't move, and Loki can't lift the hammer because obviously he's not worthy. Uh, but this last part, which it's kind of negated in Avengers, which kind of sucks, but it's actually a really good moment where Thor realizes that the only way that he can stop the Bifrost at that point is to actually destroy it. Because it's actually locked in place at that point. He can't stop it unless he destroys it. But if he destroys the Bifrost, then that means he loses his connection to Earth, and he loses his connection to Jane Foster, the woman that he now loves. And Loki tries to prey on that, but ultimately Thor realizes that him not seeing her again is palpable to uh, not destroying Jotunheim. So he uses his hammer and breaks the rainbow bridge that holds the Bifrost up, and it collapses into the ether, and gets destroyed. Um, and at the same time, Loki is battling on the edge of the bridge, and he winds up falling off into the ether as well. And Thor tries to help him but can't. So Loki is presumed to be dead, which he's not. He comes back on Avengers, but he's presumed to be dead. And now the Bifrost is destroyed, which means Thor cannot travel back to Earth. So this is another one of those kind of things. It's like the ending of Iron Man 2, where they tease like, oh, Iron Man's going to be in the Avengers, but Nick Fury doesn't want Tony Stark in the suit because he's a narcissist piece of crap. this is kind of the same idea, but they just get around it anyway. So I don't even know why there's essentially a point to this. I understand it from a plot perspective, but from from Avengers, it's like you leave the question like, oh, are they going to be in Avengers? Like, how does he get back to Earth? What happens? And then they just explain it away with a single line. I think in Avengers they explain it away with like, oh, the All Father mustered a bunch of dark energy together and sent you here. It's like, okay, he can just teleport you apparently, but it's it leaves it off on a weird note. But at the end, you see Thor, who's he's back in Asgard, and Odin wakes up from the Odin sleep, and essentially all's right in the world, basically, at the end of it, except for Thor not being able to go back to Earth. So so at the end of it all, I don't. I like Thor's. Like I said before, I like Thor's through line. I like his character arc. Some of the extenuous characters are boring or annoying. Kat Dennings did not need to be in this movie. She was there for comic relief, and it kind of sucked. Um, the Three were suitable. Sif was okay. Tom Hiddleston as Loki was great. Anthony Hopkins, I felt was really good in this movie, even though his motivations are weird and kind of skewed and don't make a lot of sense. Um, and like I said, some of the stuff on Earth, some of the stuff that's supposed to be moderately comedic, is a little can be a little off or a little cringy. The humor doesn't always hit correctly in this movie. Sometimes it doesn't work, which is why I kind of downgrade it a little bit. And like I said before, it feels fairly generic. In certain ways, when you see the things happen, you expect them to happen the way that they do, and they happen the way that they do. Um, and then the scope is really my big problem with the movie. I feel like the scope is way too short. The scope doesn't work very well for the film. Uh, but, I'm going to have to give this a rating. So I'm going to have to give it 5 dead frost beasts out of 10. So now that we've gone through Thor, we've actually made it through all of the Phase 1 Marvel movies, plus Captain Marvel. Um, and next time we will be looking at the film that brought them all together for the first time, 2012's Avengers. Thank you again for listening. Remember to leave a comment on the video, leave a like, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?